Are going to be talking again about the subject of idol worship, both in America and in the American church. And we talked last couple of sessions over the idea that idol worship is something that most Christians don't believe goes on here, something that is reserved for maybe over in Africa, with tribes and huts that are worshiping idols, or down in the Amazon. And we talked about how that idol worship is something that's happening a lot. In fact, our nation is falling apart because of idol worship. Idol worship, we gave a definition to it as a noun, a person, place, or thing, person, place, thing, or idea that is more important than God. An idol can be something that is good in our lives, like our family or our spouse, and some of those ideas. We talked about idol worship being directly tied to witchcraft, that idol worship and witchcraft are basically very similar, if not the same thing. Idol worship is something that becomes a snare to our lives, in that idol worship is something that I may worship an idol, and in the beginning, the idol gives me something. But as I go along, eventually the idol worship becomes something where it begins to take over my life, and eventually I don't control the idol controls me. Now, we didn't hit on all the things. I only come up with my teaching here about 7 points that I felt were important as the Holy Spirit led me on this subject of idol worship. Talking about it. And so I'm going to talk about one more point here, third point about idol worship that I found. And we had ended up in Psalms 106, verse 36 last time. And in that verse 36, it talked about the idols being a snare in our lives. But if you jump down and read from verse 36, it says in verse 37 and 38 that we're going to focus on, it says, they even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Now, one of the things, if you do even a basic study of the subject of Israel from pretty much the time of Abraham, well, the Israelites going into the land of Canaan and becoming a nation, and you will find that the Israelites had been plagued by the idols and the worship of the nation around them that are their sinful hearts, and I'm not throwing stones at them because we're all the same, but their sinful hearts were drawn away by these idols of the nations around them. And so over and over again in the book of Judges and by Joshua, and even as the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, and when the kings came along, and really all the way through Israel's history, there was idol worship that began to creep in. And it usually took on a form where the idol worship would start where they would begin to worship God, continue to give lip service at least to God, worship of Jehovah. Then they would begin to worship the Ashtaroths and the Molechs and the Baals of the nations surrounding them. And then they would go full blown into worship of these idols. Then God would send prophets to warn them, and then they would go into judgment. And that cycle happened throughout the book of Judges and the book of Kings, and throughout Israel's history. The major and minor prophets are all written mostly around that idea of that idol worship that was taking place. Now, I want to focus on this idea here, though, that even though we are often destroyed in the American, our lives here in America, our idol worship takes on a lot of forms. We can worship our hobbies, our beliefs, our children, our spouse, our money, our job. We worship a lot of things. But I want to focus on a very specific type of idea that happens both here in America and also in that is taking place, especially here. And I think it is taking place all over the world, but definitely here. And that is it says here in this passage that idol worship was tied to child sacrifice and sexual immorality. Now, to talk about these two, in the land of Canaan, especially with, and I believe, if I remember correctly, it might have been the god of the Moabites, but I can't remember where he specifically came from. Actually, these three entities made their way through a lot of different cultures at the time and throughout history. And in fact, a very good read, if you get a hold of it, I think it's Jonathan Cahn in his book called The Return of the Gods, and I think it was a New York bestseller. But in his book, he is a Messianic Jew, and he has made the point that the gods of the ancient world have come back, and we are again either intentionally or unintentionally worshiping them in our culture today and in America. And if you read his book, you will go, wow, yeah, I think he make a very strong point that that's taken place there. The Ashtaroth, if you read his book, and I won't go into it, talks about sexual immorality, which eventually goes over in some of the Greek gods, and they show up again in the Roman gods. And so the Ashtaroths around sexual immorality. The Baals were, and the god Molech were around the idea of gods of destruction and death, and gods that where they would throw live babies. It says they would throw live babies into the arms of Molech and in order to get good crops. And we see the same thing very much happening today in both abortion and also the amount of sexual immorality that's going on in the world around us. I mean, sex has become something that you can't go through your Facebook feed, which I do for part of the ministry here, and I'm going through my Facebook feed and see what different friends are up to, without being inundated with some sort of constant in movies and being thrown at us all the time different forms of sexual immorality, and it's gone to the place where adultery is commonplace, fornication is commonplace, and so when Jonathan Cahn makes the point in that book that when a nation is godly and leaves their godliness, then the demonic forces that affected that culture come back 7 times worse. And he makes a good point in that. And he talks about the parable of Jesus talking about, which is a really strange parable or statement, where Jesus talks about that when a man has a demon leave him and the house is swept clean and he wanders around in the dry places and he comes back and he then takes back up his residence there with 7 demons that are more deadly or more worse than him and more evil than him. In that passage, that one of the witnesses in one of the Gospels mentions the fact that it says, "So it is with this generation." And so he makes the point that any group of people that has the gospel, accepts the gospel, rejects the gospel, that the demonic forces that were affecting their life before the gospel came along will be 7 times worse after they reject the gospel and the gospel leaves. And you could go into England's history or America's history, nations that originally sent missionaries around the world. God was honored, the Bible was honored on some level, and then you talk about a wholesale rejection of God, and you see how that then these demonic forces come back into America. Now, to me, whether you agree with Jonathan Cahn or not, if you get a chance to read the book, I recommend it. It just is a good, very good kind of lesson and something to ponder. But even if you would disagree with him, I would say that if you can't look around the world and not see that the world is America and our culture is falling apart, and the nuclear family is falling apart, and I came from a divorced home from back in the 70s, and my family was a rarity then, and now is just a commonplace. The number of families where both the mom and dad are together and the kids are still together and stay together for a lifetime is now, I don't know what the numbers are, but extremely low as compared to in the past. And so we see the breakdown of the family going on, and a lot of issues going on in families and the lives of husbands and wives and kids and things that are happening and taking place here. So, but when I talk about idol worship, somebody's favorite hobby can be an idol. A lot of things can be an idol. But there is something to the idea of witchcraft and idol worship being very much tied to sexual immorality and child sacrifice. And in fact, if you read on any of the resurgence of the witchcraft that is going on in America, that two things that is pretty common, in fact, we got a third one in there, but three things that are very common to witchcraft around the world, and even idol worship at different types around the world, is that child sacrifice, cannibalism, and sexual immorality. That those are three things that seem to give the demonic forces power. They're worshipped in those ways, and those are three forms of satanic rituals that are part of the worship of the kingdom of darkness, and they're very powerful. So although we've been talking about idol worship in a very broad sense, and again, when we go over our other points, we'll talk about it in very broad sense, talking about anything, again, our husband, our wife, our kids, our car, our church, our Sunday school class, our, whatever, our pet favorite belief about something in the Bible. There are many, many good and bad things that can be worshipped above God and placed above God. Certainly, there is something to the idea that that idol worship and witchcraft very much goes into things like the cannibalism, the child sacrifice, and the sexual immorality that we see going on in the world around us. And a very good read. I recommend that you get his book and read it, and I think that you'll find it to be something that is very intellectually stimulating, and even from a theological perspective, if you like studying stuff like that, giving you some things to ponder on in your life. We'll be talking about some more points about how that idol worship in the next several points comes from our fleshly rejection of God in different ways, and then how that is affecting the church, and how that it will be necessary for us to give up our idol worship if we want to see God begin to bless the church again. It will be very important. And I want to just leave you with the blessing found in Numbers chapter 6, verses 24, 25, and 24, 25, and 26. It says, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." God bless you. We'll be back on here again probably tomorrow or the next day, and we'll continue with our study of idol worship in America and in the church. You just have a great evening.